We hear all too often about breakdown in relationships because of the way in which MPs have to be in Westminster 4 days a week, then they go back to their constituencies for the weekend. It is long hours, there are long sitting hours, there are some sometimes dark and lonely nights in politics, which leads people to do things that they might necessarily in ordinary life wouldn't do.
Let's chew over the day's political news, and there is plenty to discuss, including a senior Tory MP embroiled in a Honeytrap sexting scandal, a new analysis about the scale of the electoral threat posed by Reform UK to the Conservatives. Joining us for that analysis is the former Labour spokesperson, James Matthewson. Morning, James. He is there, I think. Good morning, James. Can you hear me? We'll come to James in a moment. We do certainly have the former Conservative advisor, Charlie Rowell. Good morning.
Morning, James. Hi.
Lots to discuss. Let's begin with the story on the front of the Times today. The Conservative MP, William Ragg, who is the chair of a Commons Select Committee, has admitted handing over the personal phone numbers of colleagues to a man he met on Grindr, the gay dating app. It led to a number of MPs, including a minister, being targeted with flirty messages and explicit photos. The Times chief political correspondent, Aubrey Allegretti, exclusively revealed the story.
There have been MPs who told me they were incredibly frightened. You know, they said, we felt like we as gay men in Parliament were somehow being targeted by somebody who wanted to hurt us or do something against us. One of them even said, you know, I worried that a horny MP could bring this person onto the estate and they might be carrying a machete. I mean, they were really worried about what this person's intentions were once they had the material they were collating.
That's the Times chief political correspondent, Aubrey Allegretti there. Charlie, William Ragg has apologised, but what on earth was he thinking?
Yes, it's not a good look, to say the least. And without making too much light of the situation, the name in which was used to honeytrap the MPs was Charlie, but I can confirm it's not me.
It's not you.
It's
Good,
not
okay.
me.
Glad we clarified.
Give your listeners some hope and comfort. But as I say, without making too much light of it, it does raise serious questions about the security of MPs and the way in which Westminster works. We hear all too often about breakdown in relationships because of the way in which MPs have to be in Westminster 4 days a week, then they go back to their constituencies for the weekend. It is long hours, there are long sitting hours, there are some sometimes dark and lonely nights in politics, which leads people to do things that they might necessarily in ordinary life wouldn't do. In this case, William Ragg, who I believe is a single and openly gay MP, was on a gay dating app and was messaging whoever was named as Charlie. One thing has led to another. Explicit messages were sent. I wouldn't encourage that from anybody in public life necessarily because of a situation like this.
It's a really interesting point you raised there, actually. Let's bring in James Matthewson, former Labour spokesperson. James, do you think Charlie's right that there is something about the nature of being an MP that, you know, maybe the loneliness of it, the long hours, that kind of leads them to do irresponsible things? I mean, you know, what is shocking in this report is that 2 MPs are understood to have responded to these unsolicited messages with explicit pictures of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's something to do with the loneliness per se. It is very concerning about the lack of kind of tech savviness, let's say, amongst MPs. I mean, there are. I mean, it goes without saying, you know, 600 odd MPs. There's a very small minority here who would do something like that. I think the majority, hopefully, wouldn't fall for such things. But yeah, I mean, wherever there's a loophole like that, it's access to power, isn't it? And that's the big concerning thing here. It's who could leverage that for their own gain and for their own benefits, and what does that put at risk with regard to our not just our democratic processes, but obviously all of our systems and our it kind of functions of state. You know, if this was a government minister, for example, you would hope that the security would be a higher level, but backbenchers often have access to government ministers and their numbers as well. So, you know, that is a huge concern.
Charlie, what should happen to William Ragg? I mean, he is already standing down as an MP at the next election, but he's still the chair of the Public Administration Committee. He's a vice chair of the Tory Backbench 1922 Committee. Should he lose the Conservative whip?
Well, I think, first and foremost, a thorough investigation has to take place to see what exactly and whose number has been given away. I think there has to be a full investigation in that. I think Will would probably welcome that and will want to comply with all of the authorities and people looking into that. I think you're absolutely right. Will has said that he's going to stand down at the next election. I think by trying to obviously be open about the conversation, it was a story that was bubbling around in Westminster for some time, but I think by coming forward and sort of apologising to colleagues, getting on the front foot to say, look, yes, he has been a victim of this honey trap. He showed a moment of weakness, that was wrong, and he's been very open about that. I think may allow him to continue if he should so wish. But if there is pressure or a suggestion that he should stand down, then maybe that's what he'll be considering over the Easter break.
And James, crucially, this raises once again wider questions about the vulnerability of our MPs to cyber attacks.
Yeah, exactly that. And the whole system, you feel like, is on, people are on the back foot already with this. And you have to remember, MPs are, for the most part, ordinary people. And I mean, a lot of them aren't, but we would like to hope that a lot of them would be. And in theory, you or I could be an MP if we were a candidate in an election. The second that you're elected, you're into the spotlight. You've got access to power. People want to leverage you. People want to try and use you for their own benefits, whether that be private industry, private business, or other nation states. So you've got to be very, very careful. And there is training. I mean, Parliament does provide excellent resources and excellent training for MPs. But you just feel like, I mean, a lot of this stuff is developing faster than anybody can get a grasp of it, and especially things like AI and deep fake. When it comes to things like that, it's really, really scary territory with regard to how that could be used to further leverage people in positions of power.
But James, do you really need training not to send unsolicited? Well, I suppose they are solicited, but indecent images of yourself to someone you've never met?
I mean, I wouldn't. I hope you wouldn't either, James. But the thing is, I can't speak for obviously William Bragg. It's stupid. I mean, he's owned up to the fact it's stupid. I think the fact here is that there are people with different levels of, I guess, naivety, but also digital kind of understanding and skill. And whilst I kind of want to, the temptation as a, ex-Labour staffer for me to go to town on this is huge. But I mean, at the same time...
But it's not a party political issue, is it?
Exactly. That's the exact point I want to make, because it's across the board. And I've seen it working in the Labour Party. I've seen especially older MPs who just haven't got a clue as to this kind of thing and trying to, teach an old dog new tricks, etc., etc. And when it comes down to it, that kind of kind of the access that you have now via smartphones and social media, if somebody manages their own, it's not too hard to try and contact an MP directly. And people say it shouldn't be, but, this is one of the risks of our democratic freedoms, I'm afraid.
Well, it's an incredible story. You can read it and read Aubrey Allegretti's piece on it in the Times this morning, and of course online with your digital subscription. Let's come on to another story. Reform UK is predicted to cost the Conservatives 41 seats if a seat-by-seat poll holds true at the general election. The YouGov poll suggests Rishi Sunak's party are on course for a worse result than the 97 Labour landslide. Their data also suggests that 1 in 3 people who voted Conservative in 2019 would now back Reform UK. Charlie, how should the Tories deal with the threat of reform?
Well, there are two things in there, because it says that if that poll is correct, 1 in 3 people are going to vote Reform. It means that they're not going to vote Labour. So it feels as though there's no real appetite to go and then vote for the Labour Party. It also slightly reminds you of, not that I don't think either you or I or even James on the line was around in 1992, but it wasn't particularly fashionable to say in 1992 that you were going to vote Conservative.
True, but they weren't 27 points behind. They were about 10 points behind for many months leading up to it, but the scale of the poll deficit is far bigger now, surely.
It is, but those polls can only, you would hope, only narrow in the run-up to a general election, as tends to be the case. And look, the polls have been wrong before. Back in 2010, we weren't sure what David Cameron was supposed to win an overall majority in 2010, ended up as a coalition government. In 2015, Ed Miliband was going to become Prime Minister. In 2016, we were supposed to remain in the EU. That never happened, obviously. In 2017, I think Theresa May had about a 15, 20-point lead at some stage.
And that evaporated over the course of the campaign, yeah.
Exactly. And, who thought in 2019 that, Boris Johnson would win an 80-seat majority? So these things always can can fluctuate and can throw up surprises. So, but I do think it's a very clear message that the Conservatives will want to carry into the general election. That is, if you vote Reform, you are going to get Labour, and you're obviously not voting for the Labour Party because you're flirting with Reform. So the only way in which you can stop Labour, and you can have policies similar to what Reform might be advocating, which is being tougher on immigration. That's why the Prime Minister is so determined to get through his Rwanda policy, and making sure that the cost of living for everybody, particularly in the north of England, particularly in Red Wall seats, who deserted the Labour Party because Labour deserted them, those constituents want to make sure that they have a government that is dealing with the cost of living crisis and dealing with migration. That's what a lot of what Reform's talking about, but it's what the Conservatives are actually doing. So stick with the Conservatives.
James, how big a worry is complacency for Labour?
It's something they are certainly worried about. And, at the moment, we're hearing all the noise that we're hearing from Lotto and from behind the scenes, the leader of the opposition's office, and indeed the campaign headquarters, is along the lines of, we can't rest on our laurels. We can't hold back now. We've done a huge amount of work, but there is still a lot more to do. And that's kind of the narrative the party's going with. But there will be concern in this for them as well, because it just comes down, there are so many seats where there's these narrow margins after that Boris Johnson victory. I do think, however, that we're looking at Reform as, kind of taking away Tory vote. These aren't traditionally Tory voters, I don't think. These were people who would have traditionally, tribally, been Labour voters. We lost a lot of them. The seats like Blythe Valley and stuff, which we lost, which we weren't even expecting to lose in 2019, which was, heartbreaking to watch at the time. Those voters went through a conversion process because of Brexit. So they went from being tribally Labour to being, a lot of them, disenfranchised with the whole political system, to then via Brexit voting for Boris Johnson's Tory party. But there's been very little done. I mean, we've heard about levelling up and all the rest of it. There's been very little done by the Tories to retain those voters. So now they've gone back to the belly of the beast and, what would have been UKIP, which is now Reform. And that's where they'll go.
James, Charlie, really appreciate your time. Thank you both. As former Labour spokesperson James Matthewson there, and the former Conservative advisor Charlie Rowell.